Greetings. I'm just about to go over a presentation that I was intending to give on the 7th of October in Houston at the Municipal League's meeting. And unfortunately, we had a administrative mix-up and I had the wrong time on my calendar and arrived just as the session should have been ending. So I'm going to go in this video go over the presentation that I was going to give, and so I'll share my screen now and start talking a little bit about demographics in Texas. So you can see, first thing is that this is the information about the 2020 census relative to the 2010 census. And you can see our population is now up over 29 million. This was of April 1st, 2020. So it's we've added some Texans since then. And you can see over the decade, we added almost 4 million Texans. And we were growing pretty quickly at almost 16% over the decade. That's faster than all other states except for Utah and Idaho. And both of those states are relatively small and relatively young as well. So much of their growth is from natural increase. So this population change and the relative population change in other states has resulted in Texas getting 2 new US congressional seats. And so those, the legislative session that's currently going on will determine where those seats are going to be. And right now, I think it looks like there's one in West Austin and Northwest Harris County. So we'll see how that all plays out, the 2 new seats. When we look at the population in the state, with the new census data, you can see we have what we refer to as a population triangle, which is Dallas-Fort Worth area, San Antonio-Austin area, and Houston as the points. But certainly the areas are filling in, certainly along I-35. And then the suburban ring areas around each of these urban cores is also filling in pretty dramatically as well. If we were to draw a line along I-35 and all the counties that intersect I-35 and all the counties east of it, that's about 87% of our total population, meaning only 13% is west of I-35. So it really highlights this dichotomy in terms of population dynamics in the state. And you'll see more of that as I go along and start talking about population change at the county level, and also talk a little bit about population change in places, cities and places. So one of the things that's interesting, especially given the dynamic that I just mentioned, is that of our 254, 143 counties lost population. All of the green counties here lost population. If you look at those, and if you're familiar with them, I'd say probably all of them could be considered to be largely rural counties. So we're certainly seeing population decline in much of rural Texas, and at the same time, we're seeing dramatic increases in the population triangle counties. And then also out west, certainly the Permian Basin is growing. Lubbock, Amarillo, El Paso, and then the lower Rio Grande Valley. If you include Laredo as well, some growth there. One of the things that this change has resulted in, the population growth, is that we've had differential growth by race and ethnicity. And so that means that now the Latino population, as of April 1st, 2020, was 39.3% of the population, and the non-Hispanic white population, 39.7%. So you can see a pretty significant decline there as a percentage of the total population for the non-Hispanic white population. And pretty dramatic increase for the Asian population, also for the non-Hispanic other, which is largely 2 or more races. When we look at population change by race and ethnicity and for the total, you can see the first row here is 2010, second row 2020. This third or fourth row, depending on how you count, is the population change over the decade. We only added 187,000 additional non-Hispanic whites over the decade, almost a little bit more than 500,000 African Americans, approaching 2 million Latinos, a little over 600,000 persons of Asian descent, and a little more than 660,000 non-Hispanic other. And so when we look at the percent change, again, I mentioned the 15.9 overall, but the non-Hispanic white population only grew by 1.6%. Latino African American almost 20, Latino a little more than 20, 64%, 65% for non-Hispanic Asian, and dramatic increases for the non-Hispanic other. And that I'll stop here and just highlight there's some shifts in terms of how the Census Bureau was processing race and ethnicity for this census compared to the last census. And more people were picked up as selecting 2 or more races in the way they processed it for the 2020 census. And so that is what is resulting in the rather dramatic increase that we're seeing here. And so if we look at contributions to total change, you can see the non-Hispanic white population contributed just a little less than 5% of our total population change, whereas the African American population, almost 14%, Latino, almost 50% of our population change, Asian, 15%, and non-Hispanic other 15%. So again, these contributions mean that basically 95% of our population change was from persons whose ancestry would indicate they're people of color. And so if we kind of look at the contributions, I guess I just referred to those in the previous slide, so I won't talk too much more about that. So if we look at it geographically in terms of population change by race and ethnicity, then I mentioned earlier that 143 counties lost population, 198 counties of the 254 lost non-Hispanic white population, 158 African Americans, 63, which I was kind of surprised given how much the Latino population has grown, but 63 counties actually lost Latino population, 49 Asian, and no counties lost non-Hispanic other. And again, that's partly because of this difference in the way that race and ethnicity is processed. So if we look at the counties that lost non-Hispanic white population or gained, you can see that all of these tan, kind of light orangish counties lost population. Almost all of them, with the exceptions of Tarrant, Dallas, and Harris County, are kind of, and I guess Brazoria, are kind of relatively rural counties. But you can see Travis County, Williamson County, significant increases in the non-Hispanic white population. The suburban ring counties around Dallas and around Houston, we saw increases there as well. When we look at Latino, the most significant growth in Latino population was in Harris County, the Houston area, but certainly significant growth in Dallas and Tarrant County, as well as Bexar County, where San Antonio is. And some increase in the lower Rio Grande Valley and El Paso. African American, all the blue counties lost African American population. Much of East Texas has a high concentration of African American, and many of those counties lost population, or if they gained, it was relatively small gains of African American population. But the counties, in particular Tarrant, for the Fort Worth area, and Harris County or Houston, have pretty dramatic increases in the African American population. And then we also see, some of the other suburban ring counties in Dallas County having pretty significant increases in African American population, Bexar County and Bell County. So this is just talking about population change as components of population change. Population changes from net migration, which is in migration minus out migration. And here we have it broken out into international migration and domestic migration. And then natural increase, which is births minus deaths. You can see here that, actually look over here at these pie charts, you can see that between 2000 and 2010, more than half of our population change was from natural increase. And in 2010 to 2020, a little less than half. We also see a shift in domestic migration, where domestic migration now is almost a third of, last decade was almost a third of our population change, whereas it was only 22%. And I attribute much of that to the fact of the recession and the fact that Texas fared fairly well. We're also a business-friendly state. And so a lot of companies have been moving here, and coming out of the recession, certainly we were in a much better position to attract new business. And the cost of living here is pretty reasonable compared to states that are sending domestic migrants, and I'll talk about that here shortly. When we look at the most significant changing population, counties by population, you can see Harris County added more people than all but one county in the country, adding over 645,000. Much of its population change was from natural increase, more births than deaths. The population in Harris County is relatively young, meaning there are fewer older people to die and more people in the reproductive ages to having babies. We also see it had net out domestic migration. And if you kind of go down here and look at Dallas County, those two counties both had net out domestic migration. They both had declines in the non-Hispanic white population as well. But then if you look at some of the other counties, again, you can see some variation, and essentially the counties that are suburban ring counties, a relatively small percentage of their change is from natural increase, and higher percentages are from domestic migration. And I'll talk more about that on the next slide. So these are the fastest growing counties, and you can see here Hays and Comal counties were the fastest growing counties in the country. Those are the two counties in between Austin and San Antonio. So San Marcos is in Hays County, and New Braunfels in Comal County. Williamson, just north of Austin. Fort Bend is just south of Houston. So essentially, almost all of these counties would be considered suburban ring counties. I suppose the exception might be Midland County. But the others are suburban ring counties. And if you go over to this last column and you see how much of their growth, and actually I guess Collin County is becoming an urban core county. But if you look at most of their growth is happening from domestic migration. So when we see counties or places that are growing really fast, usually that's because there's very significant domestic migration there. And relatively small percentage of their population change is from natural increase, more births than deaths. Now here's zooming in to cities, and I know this kind of looking at this, you'll probably have a hard time picking your city out, but I am going to zoom in here in a little bit so you can kind of look at some of the other areas. But this is just looking at 4 places, and these are places that existed in 2010 and also in 2020. So if a place went away, it wouldn't be here, or if a place didn't exist or hadn't been incorporated, in 2010, and it had been over the decade, and now was in 2020, it wouldn't be on this list because we're just looking at change. The other thing that's not accounted for here is the fact that some places also have annexed over the decade, and the count that we have from 2010 doesn't have the additional people that may have been added as a function of annexation. So you got a kind of a mix here. So if a place is growing quickly from annexation, it's probably not necessarily, it may or may not be growing from natural increase and or migration. But again, you can see, if you look at most of the urban areas, they're all in the green colors, and you see they're all growing pretty significantly. You can see out in East Texas, some places that are declining in population, Wichita. If you look out west, some of these smaller cities out west, and this is, if you think back to the county level map, I mean, this is kind of the story there. We have some pockets of growth in the more rural parts, but a lot of the places are actually losing population in much of rural Texas. And so here, zooming in at the San Antonio, Austin area, and certainly you can see San Antonio and Austin growing dramatically. New Braunfels and San Marcos growing pretty quickly. But again, you can see little cities that are kind of out lying in the more rural parts of the area, losing population. And then here, zooming into the Houston area. So you can, again, you see, there are even little places in Harris County that are losing population. The city is actually, Harris County is actually adding a fairly significant number. So that's, I think, kind of interesting. And then here's the Dallas area. Again, you can see Wichita losing population. And again, some of the out in the suburb, not suburban, the rural parts outside of the urban core, cities that are losing population. And then here, zooming in, one looking at West Texas. And you can see, again, see little places, and then looking at the lower Rio Grande Valley and the Corpus Christi area. So then, excuse me. Then if we look at here by race and ethnicity, I'm only going to show you, I think, a couple, just to kind of highlight that we're seeing variable shifts here by shifts in race and ethnic composition. So this is changes in the Latino population. Look at the urban cores or at the state overall, see pretty significant increases, but you do see little pockets here and there, little cities, places that are losing Latino population. You're zooming into Bexar County area. Again, you see little cities out in the rural parts of the state that are losing population, but certainly the urban core of San Antonio has gained significant Latino population. But almost, many of these areas are adding Latinos pretty significantly. Here's Harris County and kind of the Houston area. This actually goes all the way over to San Antonio. You basically see, again, there's little cities around that have lost Latino population over the decade. And same thing for the Dallas area. Look how dramatically Fort Worth has grown in terms of Latino population over the decade. And then zooming in on Lower Rio Grande Valley and West Texas. So essentially you see the urban cores or the areas that are adding both total population, but Latino population. And given that the Latino population growth accounted for about 50% of our total population change, you would kind of expect this to look similar to, and it does look pretty similar to total population change. And then here's non-Hispanic white. And I think this is kind of interesting because you actually see a lot of areas that, a lot of cities that have lost non-Hispanic white population. So if we zoom in here, you can see the city of San Antonio had decline in the non-Hispanic white population. And then a lot of other kind of little cities as well have had declines in non-Hispanic white population as well. And I thought this was kind of interesting because Harris County had a net decline in non-Hispanic white, but the city of Houston itself had an increase in the non-Hispanic white population. But you see little pockets here, and then much of the unincorporated area probably also had declines in the non-Hispanic white population as well. And then, of course, this, not exactly, I can't remember what city that is, if it's Pasadena, maybe, but, you know, pretty significant decline in non-Hispanic white population there. And then here's the Dallas-Fort Worth area. So kind of looking kind of the in between Dallas and Fort Worth, you see significant declines. Of course, both Tarrant County and Dallas County had net declines in non-Hispanic white population, but Dallas, the city, had significant increases, as well as Fort Worth, the city, had significant increases as well. And then if you look at the much of West Texas had declines in non-Hispanic white population. I mean, much of the places in West Texas. Similarly, if you look at the lower Rio Grande Valley and Corpus Christi, declines as well. So I'm not, if I could go through and show you African American and Asian and so on, but I'm going to stop and not go into all of those, because I think these are the two groups that have some of the non-Hispanic white and the Latino, some of the more significant shifts that we've seen. Oh wait, I guess I do have black. Okay, so I'll go through this pretty quickly. If you look here, you can see there are just a few areas, especially if you kind of look in East Texas, that had declines in African American population. If we zoom into San Antonio, Austin, you see San Antonio and Austin had pretty significant increases in the African American population, and many of the other urban areas or the cities did. Again, if you look at rural parts, we see that there are declines in the African American population. In Houston, you see significant increase for Houston itself, and for many of the cities that are kind of around Houston, but also little cities that have significant declines in African American. And then the Dallas area, increases in pretty much all of the cities in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. But then when you move out into the suburban ring, and then if you look at Wichita, as you recall, it had total decline, and also decline in the non-Hispanic white population, but it had an increase in African American. And then kind of mixed in terms of West Texas and the lower Rio Grande Valley. All right, so anyway, I'm now just going to shift and talk a little bit about population change and dynamics at the county level. Here you can see all of the blue counties, and the green ones had positive natural increase, more births than deaths. The rural counties tended to have smaller amounts of births relative to deaths. But if you look at all these yellow counties, so in East Texas, this whole sort of path here, and in parts of West Texas and Northeast Texas, more deaths than births. And essentially what's happened there is younger people have moved out of those areas. I think if we look and moved into the more urban areas, so there are fewer young people there having children and more older people. And so the net result of that is that you have more deaths than births. And if you kind of look at this hill country area like Gillespie, which is Fredericksburg, Llano, and Kerr counties, these are pretty big retirement areas. And so relatively speaking, the population is older there. And so again, they have more deaths than births there as well. Here's looking at domestic migration. And all of the yellow counties had net out domestic migration. Notice they're almost all rural counties. The exception is in the lower Rio Grande Valley, where we saw net out domestic migration for many of the counties that are urban there, Webb County with Laredo. But many of the others, and with the exception of Harris County and Dallas County, had net out domestic migration. So more people leaving to other places than coming from other places in the US. But if you look again at those suburban ring counties, the ones I said earlier were growing really fast, as well as Bexar County and Travis County, Tarrant County, they're growing because a lot of people, domestic migrants, are moving there, and that's driving much of their growth. So speaking of domestic migrants, where are they coming from? Or where are they going? And I've cut out a bunch of them here because a bunch of them is pretty much close to a wash. But the state that has sent the most net migrants to Texas over the decade is California, and Illinois, Florida, New York. Puerto Rico has had pretty significant net out migration. Louisiana has traditionally been a net sender of migrants to Texas, New Jersey. So most of these are kind of, with the exception, I mean, they're big states, and the cost of living in many of these states is higher than it is in Texas. And economically, many of them are struggling relative to Texas as well. We do lose a few people to Colorado, Oklahoma, Washington, North Dakota, Oregon. Probably at least Oklahoma, Colorado, and North Dakota, many of the net out migrants, maybe Montana as well, are people working in the oil and fracking industry and are going to those places to work there. One of the things we've also seen now is declining fertility. And I'm going to talk a little bit about this because it's certainly if you're from a city that's in a more rural place, you're seeing your population aging. And part of that has to do with there aren't younger people there having children. But if we look at this, the total fertility rate of 2.1 is considered to be replacement fertility. And anything below that, you'll start seeing indications of population decline. Eventually, if the rate stays below 2.1 for a generation, you'll certainly will see declines in the total population. And so if you look with the recession, Texas had previously been above replacement fertility, and in 2011 fell below it. Utah, which has one of the highest fertility rates, maybe the highest fertility rates in the country, fell below replacement fertility in 2018. The US has been below replacement overall. New York State, California fell below just as the recession was starting, Massachusetts. So the effect of this is then you're going to have fewer children than you had in previous cohorts. So here's looking at 2010 and 2020 in a generational population pyramid. Males are on the left and females are on the right. And the point I'm trying to get across here with talking about fertility, if you kind of look at 2010 and the 0 to 1, they're now 10 years old in 2020. If you look at this indentation at the bottom, essentially that is saying that our fertility has declined to a point where we're not, if that continues, and those cohorts will kind of move up through the population pyramid, we'll start seeing a contraction of the population pyramid and the population. And that has economic implications. I mean, so all of our school buildings that we've built for these cohorts that have come through and that we can accommodate all the students in our schools, we're not going to need all those schools or the classrooms anymore as this younger cohort ages up into the school age. For our universities, same thing. And then we talk about labor force, all of a sudden we're going to have a labor shortage. So that certainly is a concern. And certainly if you're in a place that has a declining population, labor force is an issue, and it will continue and perhaps be a more significant issue as these younger cohorts age up through our school systems and into the labor force. Here's looking at the Latino population and the non-Hispanic white population. The columns are single years of age, so the red are the non-Hispanic white. This little bump here is the baby boom. As they age to the right, they're going to die. And then if you look at the younger ages, there aren't more non-Hispanic whites to replace the baby boom age generation as they die. Previous predictions we'd produced indicated the non-Hispanic white population would start declining around 2035 in Texas. But a more recent set that we did that had incorporated new migration data from this past decade indicates that the non-Hispanic white population isn't going to decline in the near future if migration rates of this last decade continue, because that's somewhat offsetting this pretty significant impact on the non-Hispanic white population that's going to occur as the baby boom age generation dies. And for the Latino population, see, there's no baby boom, but in recent years, the Latino population fertility has declined, and they're starting to see declines there as well. So the pattern looks somewhat similar also to the non-Hispanic white population. Here's the non-Hispanic white population age pyramid. You can see it really is almost an inverted pyramid with really low fertility rates. The non-Hispanic white populations had below replacement fertility for some time. The reason that Texas's fertility has been above replacement until recent years is largely because of our significant minority population, in particular Latino and African American. Look at the Latino population, see a much wider base, but you also see this indentation that I was talking about with declining fertility among Latinos. And then in this one, we've added on African American, Asian, and everybody else. And again, you can still see that at the bottom, that indentation. And then when we add the non-Hispanic white population here in the middle, you see this indentation at the bottom even more significantly. A significant challenge for us in Texas is the differential educational attainment by race and ethnicity. The Latino population added about half of our total population change over the decade. And yet educational attainment among Latinos is substantially lagging behind that of non-Hispanic white and actually all other race ethnic groups, with only 40% of Latinos that are 25 years of age and older having some college or more, compared to, for example, the non-Hispanic white population, which is essentially a little over 70% have some college or more. And so the question is, as the Latino population ages, will their educational attainment begin to look more similar to the non-Hispanic white population? And I think it probably will, but the question is, how long will it take? And will we have the educated labor force, the skilled labor force that we need for an economy that's increasingly demanding higher skilled workers? So I think that's one of our bigger challenges, and it's a challenge, statewide, but ultimately education happens at the local level at our independent school districts. And so that's kind of where, we have to really focus on ensuring that young Latinos finish secondary school and hopefully get some post-secondary education, if not a bachelor's degree or graduate degrees, but certainly certificates or associate degrees are really important for Texas. And we have seen improvements for all race ethnic groups. Note here, so between 2007 and 2019, you can see that the increase in the Hispanic percent with a bachelor's degree or higher it increased by 5.4%. That seems like it's not a lot, but it's like more than half of the 10.7% of Latinos that had a bachelor's degree in 2007. So that's actually, pretty significant by increasing by a third over the decade, which is actually pretty significant. Okay, in terms of population change and projected change, you can see that we see the urban areas continuing to grow. We see much of rural Texas projected to have declines. And actually, if you look at this 2020 census compared to the 2010, it certainly indicates that our projection seems to be in line with what we've seen over this last decade. And then here is percent change, which is the speed of change. And here you can see the suburban ring counties are those that are really, we're anticipating they're the ones that are going to really be growing fast. Permian Basin, again, some of the numbers in some of these counties are relatively small, but they are likely to grow pretty significantly. Again, that's all in the Permian Basin, assuming that oil extraction activity continues the way that it has this last decade. And then projecting the population forward, you can see our projection was a little bit higher than the census count. And we now are going to do a new set of projections using data from this last decade to project forward. And we'll essentially start from what the census count is. But we're forecasting that Texas will be up at over 47 million by 2050. So that's pretty significant population change. And then when we look at it by race and ethnicity, we've forecasted that right about now, pretty soon, the Latino population will exceed that of the non-Hispanic white population, and will continue to grow. Non-Hispanic white population will grow, but pretty slowly. And then the Asian population almost at parity with the African American population by 2050. I'm just going to highlight a few resources on our website. With the redistricting data, the 2020 census data that have been released, we've put some tools on there. This tool here on the right, if you slide this bar to the left or to the left is 2010 and to the right is 2020. So you can kind of see how a county has changed, and then you can zoom all the way down to the block level and see how things, or census tract level, or I think block group is another level that's in there. So you're able to kind of go up and down in terms of geography. And then we have another tool that's specifically for places that you all might have interest in, that has a map, so you can zoom in there, you can select a place, and then it will give you the racial and ethnic composition, give you information about group corridors, and then also show you population change over the last couple of decades for those places as well. So that's pretty much all I've got. This should be up on our website, and I think Municipal League is also planning to distribute this as well. So that's it. Thank you very much.